Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the wild Von Manor. And as you could see from my duds, it's time for another June on the Range video where I'm going to be talking about some of the things I've been reading for June on the Range. It's an update video, which I should have done a week ago, but didn't. Well, here it is now. So June on the Range, which is a month devoted to Western fiction. It's a reading event that's going on this month. And I invented this reading event, and I figured that I would be the only one doing it. But surprisingly, I managed to get a whole gang of co-hosts, who I'll link down below, and some of my viewers have been reading some Westerns, some people for the very first time ever. Westerns at one time were a huge genre, and Westerns sold like crazy. Not so much anymore. Those days are gone. Once Westerns ruled the range. Not anymore. So it's been fun. It's been fun to revisit Westerns. I hadn't read any for a while. I've read a lot of Westerns in my life, but it's been a while since I've read any. And so this has been a fun time, even though I haven't read nearly as much as I hoped I would, because I've been very, very, very busy. We just had Juneteenth. In the city where I work, Juneteenth is a big deal. So the Juneteenth celebration that happened on Sunday was a big deal. And yeah, work has been, well, it's been busier than usual, which means I haven't had a ton of reading time. So I've probably read as much this month as some of my co-hosts read in like a day. Some of my co-hosts read a lot. But what have I been reading for June on the Range? Like I said, I meant to catch up earlier, but here it is. Here's what I've been reading on June on the Range. First thing I read so far this month has been this book, Shadow on the Trail by Zane Grey. I decided to start off with Zane Grey, the classic Western writer, an early best-selling Western writer, Zane Grey. Very popular writer, and for a long time remained popular. This was a good book. It was about an outlaw who eventually reforms and helps defend a ranch from some larger cattle barons. You know, it's that kind of story. It's a defend the ranch kind of story. And it was a good one. Very melodramatic, as Zane Grey tends to be. Every time the characters speak, they very often speak in speeches, and you can practically hear the orchestral music in the background as they speak, because it's all very, very dramatic. Very good action in this book. Moves right along. Has some unfortunate racial slurs, which you'll find in these old-timey Zane Grey books. Which is unfortunate, but not unexpected, considering it's a Zane Grey book. But a good book, I have to say. I enjoyed it, and it was a good way to start off June on the Range. And then I moved on to the best-selling Western writer of all time and one of the best-selling writers of all time, Louis L'Amour. And I read Crossfire Trail, which I've talked about. I talked about the Louis L'Amour books I read. So Crossfire Trail, it was a good one. It is another Defend the Ranch story. There are a lot of those in Western fiction. And this was a good one. It's an early work by Louis L'Amour, and a really good one. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. Crossfire Trail by Louis L'Amour. And then I read an even better book by Louis L'Amour, Fallon, about this shifty gambler who is trying to run a scam on some people and ends up feeling responsible for a lot of the people he was going to be running a scam on. And he ends up kind of a heroic character. Kind of. This was a lot of fun. Fallon, an excellent book. Really, really good characters in this book. And some really excellent action in this book. Louis L'Amour, he he knows how to write a fast-paced, exciting story. And his books tend to be on the thinner side because they just rocket right along. But his characters tend to be pretty good. He does good character work in his westerns. And so, yeah, this one was an excellent one. Really enjoyed Fallon. So after that, I read a book I've been wanting to read for a while, and this one is by Wayne D. Overholser. Wayne D. Overholser, very popular Western writer who wrote a ton of Westerns. So a lot of the guys who wrote Westerns in the 50s and 60s, a lot of paperback originals, they wrote a lot. This guy wrote a lot, and this is Buckskin Man. There's the Buckskin Man there on the cover. And this is about some homesteaders who are trying to set up a home on land that is claimed by a big rancher. The rancher has no legal right to this land, but he's pretending like he does. And so he's just a big evil cattle baron, basically. Although an interesting one, because he's not all bad. He's an interesting character. Overholser was really good with characters. And he didn't usually have just one-dimensional characters in his book. The Buckskin Man himself, the hero, is this big, strong guy, but he's also incredibly lazy. He's kind of a bum, basically, and he's spent most of his life avoiding work. And eventually, in this book, he finds himself having to act responsibly. And it was entertaining. This was a good book, Buckskin Man. Excellent Western, a lot of fun. Again, a little thin thing, like a lot of these Westerns were. Back in the day, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the paperbacks tended to be a lot thinner than they are nowadays. Buckskin Man, good book. I like that one. After that, I moved on to Nelson Nye and Born to Trouble. This is Born to Trouble by Nelson Nye. Nelson Nye, an interesting writer, popular writer, another popular writer of paperback originals, who wrote a lot. And in this book is interesting because it's basically a mystery. One thing about Western novels is that you can tell any kind of story in a Western novel. It doesn't have to be just one kind of story. And you can tell action stories, you can tell romance stories, or mystery stories, or horror stories in the West. And this is a mystery story. It's about this young kid who really, really, really wants to become a ranger. And he's always hanging around the ranger headquarters trying to get the ranger boss. That's what he calls him. He calls him the ranger boss. This kid, Jimmy, he's trying to get the ranger boss to hire him. And the boss is like, no, you're a kid. Get out of here. But a Western trope shows up in this book, which is the young woman who has inherited a mine. And the mine is being sabotaged, and things are being stolen from the mine. And who is doing this? It's a mystery. And her uncle has disappeared, and eventually his body shows up. And so it's a murder mystery. And there's no rangers to send out there because the rangers are all busy. And so the ranger boss has to hire Jimmy just so he has somebody to go out and look into this. And he knows it's a bad idea, I think, but he's desperate. So he hires Jimmy. And Jimmy is the worst detective ever. He's terrible because he has no idea what he's doing. And that part is pretty realistic. He rides into this town, this mining town, which is really wild and dangerous. And he has no experience. And he immediately gets himself in trouble. Every decision he makes is the wrong decision. Everything he does is wrong. He's a terrible detective. And he ends up getting in tons of trouble because he is born to trouble. Although the title doesn't refer to him, actually. But he does get in lots of trouble. Gets beat up, gets shot at, gets stabbed, gets framed for murder. Everybody's trying to kill him. And he still has to solve the mystery. Which, of course he does, because it's that kind of story. But it was very entertaining. I like that one. Now the next one really took me by surprise because I was not expecting this book to be what it was. So this is Richard Matheson's Shadow on the Sun. Shadow on the Sun is a horror story, which surprised me because Richard Matheson in the 90s, he wrote a series of westerns. That's what he was into doing in the 90s. Richard Matheson, famous for the science fiction horror novels I Am Legend and The Shrinking Man and a bunch of other stuff, including some really, really good Twilight Zone episodes. He was a very well-respected writer, and by the time the 90s came around, he could have written whatever he wanted and gotten it published. But for some reason, he really was interested in writing westerns at the time. And they were really good, but they were straight westerns. They were not supernatural horror stories taking place in the West. But this one was that. And it surprised me because I was expecting just a western. I wasn't expecting a supernatural horror story because nothing on the title or the cover or anywhere on this book says that's what it's going to be. It very much is a supernatural horror story. And I realized it about a third of the way into the book. I'm thinking, okay, this is creepy and this is a horror novel. Which it is, which was a pleasant surprise because I've never read this book. And so I got a Richard Matheson horror novel that I'd never read, which was wonderful. A lot of fun, this book. Really short, fast-paced, lean horror novel with excellent characters. And it had to take place in the West because it has to do with a treaty that was signed between the Apaches and the United States government. And some people were killed. These young men were killed. And, of course, suspicion falls immediately upon the Apaches. And this threatens the treaty, which means bloodshed could ensue. However, you know right away that the Apaches didn't do this. Something else is responsible. And what that something else is really interesting, actually. And so this was a gory, scary, fun horror novel. It's not his best work, not by a long shot. But as a fun, fast-paced horror read, this is pretty darn good. Shadow on the Sun. And like I said, that's not what I was expecting it to be. So it was fun that's what it was. That was cool. And that's all I have had time to read because I've been so busy. However, I am about a third way into this. I should finish this up in the next couple days, I think. This is Gene Hackman's Payback at Morning Peak, which I might do an individual review on because it's interesting that Gene Hackman, he's the movie star Gene Hackman, wrote this book. And apparently Gene Hackman wrote some other books with this other guy, like they co-wrote books together. But this was a book he wrote on his own, Payback at Morning Peak. I guess he wrote a couple books, and this was one of them. And I've heard good things about it, actually. I was going to ignore it completely because I figured, a book written by an actor, how good could it be, right? But it's okay. It's not great. There's some issues with this book, but it's not bad. It reminds me a lot of one of those old paperback original westerns. It's a little longer. It's a little more violent, but a good book. Overall, it has some issues. This book. But I'm enjoying it. So far. And I might do an individual review on this if anybody wants to see that. It's just interesting that Gene Hackman wrote a book. So I'm reading that now, and I'm realizing that June is fast running out. If I have time, I will throw in one other paperback original, probably a Luke short if I have time this week. And then next week will be the last week of June on the Range. And it's not even a full week. What does it go till Thursday? the month is done on Thursday or something, next Thursday. So I'm going to be starting this probably this weekend. Probably. Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove, which everybody in the world tells me is the greatest Western ever written. And somehow I've not read this book. I don't know how I've managed not to read this book, but I haven't read this book. So I'm going to start this. Like I said, probably this weekend. And I won't be able to finish it before June is out. That's for sure. It's a little bit of a big book. Yeah, it's long, this one. It's a mammoth. But I've really been looking forward to this one. So, yeah, I'm going to be reading this real soon. So that's everything I've read so far this month. Like I said, it's not nearly as much as I was hoping it would be. But, you know, I've been busy. I'm a busy man. So yeah, June on the Range. You have a great day.